Working at the studio was not at all what I thought it was going to be. I mean, it wasn't bad. Anything was better than being a delivery guy for Mr. Schwartz, outside in the heat of a New York summer. That being said, I'm not sure I would have chosen to be a delivery guy inside in the heat of a New York summer either. Especially in a stuffy, airless animation studio. That's not to say that there weren't some advantages. Watching the artists at work was a huge one, of course, when they let me. Jacob always allowed me to glance over his shoulder a bit, but Richie, he hid his work from me like he was writing secret messages to the Allies during the war. Also, honestly, being able to tell people from the neighborhood I was working uptown for Joey Drew Studios was pretty great too. They were impressed. They were jealous. And the folks I met at work were pretty swell too. Most of them. Miss Lambert, who ran the art department, was a bit severe, and sometimes frustrated me when she told me to sit down at my desk and stop hovering all the time. She also wore men's suits, which I found fascinating and definitely an inspiration for some kind of character I figured I would create. Someday. When she finally allowed me to draw. Which couldn't come soon enough. I wanted to learn. I wanted to be part of the group. Then there was the rest of the team, Richie, Dave, and Jacob, who I'd met that first day. They were like this little gang, almost. Their desks sat in a row along the wall under 3 bright lights. Richie and Jacob looked to be in their 20s and were full of energy. Richie was rough around the edges and always reeked of cigarette smoke. The tips of his fingers were even yellow, which I learned when he passed me some new sketches, looking over the top of his small round glasses at me with suspicion. His clothes always looked a bit wrinkled, and that made me feel better since, after the Sammy incident, I now had only one set of shirt and trousers to my name. Didn't even have a suit jacket. Jacob, on the other hand, was a snappy dresser with brightly colored ties and matching socks. I didn't even know they made socks in colors other than black and white. Sometimes he'd even wear his hat indoors. He seemed okay enough, though he was the one who teased me the most. He couldn't seem to let go of the whole me being covered in ink thing. At least when he brought it up, he smiled. The fact was he teased everyone, so I tried not to take it personally. Dave was older than all of us, and his skin was as thin and dry as a piece of paper. After Dot had explained what had happened in the studio after the war, I wondered how an older fellow like him felt about taking orders from a woman, if he was stuck in old traditions and stuff. But he didn't seem to care much. He didn't do anything, apparently, but draw and take long lunch breaks. He didn't really talk with anyone. He turned in his work on time and went home on time, except when the department was under deadline. But because my job was a gopher, as they called it, I got to know people outside just my department. Generally, I took things from one person and gave them to another. There was a lot of coordinating that had to go on in the building, and I was the one bringing everyone together. I felt like that alone ought to have earned me a bit more respect, but that was definitely the lowest rung on the ladder for now. So I brought scripts from the story department to the art department, sheet music from the music department to the animation lab, receipts from everyone to accounting, and bills from accounting to everyone. I got to know the secretaries. I got to know the bosses. I got to learn that Sammy was Samuel Lawrence, composer, award-winning musician, and head of the music department. Seeing him not covered in ink for the first time was strange for me. The angles of his body were even more pronounced now that he wasn't hidden under the goopy ink. He kind of looked like a bird, especially when he'd sit at the conductor's stand during rehearsals. The violinist still gave me the creeps. I got to know Norman Polk, the guy who'd led me upstairs during the blackout, though he had no interest in getting to know me. He ran the projector, which I learned happened when they needed to sync up sound with a moving image, so there was a projector booth up in the music room like I'd noticed that time. And there was one in the voice recording studio too. Norman knew all the actors and musicians, and he watched when they performed. I could tell that. He watched from behind the flashing light of the projector. I didn't know him super well, but the few times we interacted, I got the feeling he didn't like me. Called me Drew's gopher, which wasn't true. But also, I didn't know what was wrong with that. It was almost like he didn't like Mr. Drew or something, which I didn't understand. How could you not like him? I'd only met an actor once in those first few weeks. I'd held the door for her on the way into the building and was struck by how not like anyone else in the studio she looked. I mean, she looked like she stepped right out of the pictures. On the day when I held the door for her, she was wearing a light gray skirt and jacket with a pink blouse underneath. She wore a small hat with a lace front that covered one of her eyes, but not completely. I have to say, I never understood why she was a voice actress. She was just as pretty as Ginger Rogers, with the same kind of platinum blonde hair, too. We'd ended up in the elevator together, and I'll tell you, she was very nice, said thank you when I held the grate for her, and even asked me my name. Buddy. It was all I could manage to say. I couldn't even ask what hers was. Well, I'm Allison, which is funny, right? She said with a smile as we rose. I didn't want to stare, and I didn't understand why Allison was funny, so I just shifted from foot to foot on the floor of the elevator. Because of Alice. Allison, Alice, it's so close, see? I could tell she was looking at me. She wanted me to find it funny and clever. Come on, buddy, come on. Oh, you're the voice of Alice Angel, I said loudly as the elevator landed on my floor. Allison laughed. Yes, well, it looks like this is your stop. Nice to meet you, buddy. She stuck out her small gloved hand and I took it quickly in my sweaty one, shook once, and practically ran out of the elevator into the art department. Hadn't seen her since then, and honestly I was relieved by that. I did get to see Dot more often. Ever since our strange adventure, she'd decided we were friends, and while I still didn't exactly get why she'd decided that, I didn't mind it either. It was nice when she sought me out at lunch, or showed me a new script she was working on and explained it to me instead of just handing it to me and ignoring me like the other writers did. Maybe it was because we were close to the same age. Maybe it was because even though she got to actually write and wasn't a gopher like me, it still seemed like she was getting the grunt work of the story department and was on the lowest rung like I was. She mostly corrected spelling and grammar from what I could tell, but at lunch she'd sit at my desk in the dark corner of the art department as the pipes overhead made their grunts and groans and tell me all about different Bendy stories she'd come up with.
I've got a great one, with him as a cowboy,
she said, biting into her sandwich. I like cowboys, I replied. Maybe it was just her gut instinct about me that made us friends. I didn't really care. It was nice to have a pal. The one person I didn't see, however, not once the whole time, was Mr. Drew. I understood he was busy. He was in charge of the whole thing. I hadn't expected that he would come and check on me in person, or invite me to lunch, or anything like that, but I did think that maybe he'd want to follow up at least once after hiring me. Maybe I'd just been imagining things like I did, but I really thought he'd liked me.
That's just Mr. Drew,
Dot said. She'd convinced me to go out after work to the pub across the street. It was a small, crowded hole in the wall down a couple stairs where clearly a lot of after-work types hung around. The place was full of men and even some women crowded against the bar and sitting at the few tables by the door and in the back. The air was so thick with cigarette smoke, it made me cough at first. Dot was 18, so she could drink, but I was a little relieved when she grabbed a root beer instead. Helped me not feel quite so babyish. We'd collected our beverages from the bartender and found a spot by the wall. What's just Mr. Drew? I asked, almost yelling above the noise.
Disappearing, that's what he does. Just stick with your work, that's all you need to do.
I sighed, but I knew Dot couldn't hear it. I leaned in to talk into her ear. It's just that I'm not doing the work I want to do. I need him to tell Miss Lambert to let me draw. Dot shook her head and gave me a smile.
You don't need permission, buddy,
she shouted back.
Just do it. Draw.
I shook my head. No, I don't have time. I'm running around all day. You know that.
Then do it at home. Draw some Bendy stuff. Show Miss Lambert.
On what? I asked myself. With what? Dot didn't understand. Yeah, I had a pencil and scrap paper, but I needed proper tools. The paper at the studio was thick and crisp and absorbed the ink. I couldn't just hand over the back of a grocery receipt. I didn't want to anyway. Didn't want them to see how little we spent on food. I can't. Dot looked at me. I was getting used to the look now, so I just looked back. If she could read my mind, if she could just figure out my issue without me having to tell her, that would be great. And then, she did. Not really, of course. She just had this way of knowing what people were actually thinking, not what they said they were thinking. She didn't say anything. She just reached into her pocket and passed me her key.
Borrow it. I'll keep it in my desk from now on in case you need it again.
I didn't take it, just stared at it. You want me to use this? I said slowly.
Yes.
To...
Get yourself the right materials, buddy. Get yourself some paper and some ink.
I shook my head. That's stealing.
It's borrowing. You're doing this for the sake of the studio, after all. On your own time, no less. And anyway, you want to show some initiative. This is how you do it.
On the one hand, she was right. It didn't seem like that big a deal. It wasn't like I was going to take the stuff and then sell it to the kids in the neighborhood or anything. On the other hand...
Think about it,
she said. I pocketed the key quickly. You're a bad influence, I said with a little laugh. Dot shrugged like she did.
Maybe just more of a pragmatic influence. They hired you for a job, so do your job.
Pragmatic. Didn't know that word at the time. I looked it up later. Pragmatic meant dealing with stuff sensibly, taking out the emotion, making a choice because it's practical. Didn't think I agreed with her that that's what this was, but I wanted to. I'll think about it. And I did. I thought about it all night lying there in bed, next to the bony figure of my grandfather, whistling rhythmically through his nose as he slept. I must have dozed off at some point, but it felt like I had spent hours awake, thinking about living like this, with my ma, now with my grandfather, sleeping here, in the big bed, in the big room, in an apartment hardly big enough for a single person, let alone a family. All the other families in my building living with 5 people or more. This big room belonged to my parents until my pa died, and then it belonged to me. You're so tall now, buddy, Ma had said. I don't need that much room. Tall, like he'd have been tall. Imagine more rooms. Imagine an apartment that didn't suck in the heat and suffocate you inside. Imagine owning a suit. Couldn't borrow my pa's. I couldn't put it on. I just couldn't. I wasn't going to have more rooms in a suit as a gopher. I was too old to be a delivery boy. And anyway, the studio had so much paper and ink, it was drowning in it. Like Sammy. Covered in ink. Running through actual pipes, apparently. When I woke up in the morning, I decided I knew what to do. Dot was right. It was the pragmatic choice. It was the only choice.